Welcome to the Inspiring Illustrations channel. The incredible story of Jacob, the man who wrestled with God and won. Bible stories. Throughout human history, few figures are as fascinating and complex as Jacob. An imperfect man, entangled in personal and family conflicts, whose journey reflects the struggles we all face at some point in our lives. Jacob was not just an ordinary man. He was someone who carried the weight of his choices, a heart full of doubts, and yet a divine promise that seemed distant and unattainable. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of his story is the night he wrestled with God, a struggle that would transform his identity forever. Pause for a moment and think, have you ever felt like you were in a battle against something greater than yourself? Maybe it was a moment of doubt, an unexpected loss, or even an overwhelming sense of emptiness. Jacob knew what that was like. He was alone, exhausted, and on the brink of an encounter that would change everything. His story, however, is not just about suffering. It is about perseverance, about not giving up until finding purpose in the midst of pain. In this video, you will discover how Jacob's wrestling with God goes far beyond a simple biblical narrative. It reflects the internal battles we face every day, spiritual doubts, fears, and the constant search for direction. And just like Jacob, you too can find strength and meaning by facing your challenges head-on. Before we proceed, I would like to extend a special invitation to new viewers. If this content is sparking your curiosity or resonating with something you are experiencing, subscribe to our channel now and turn on notifications. Here, we explore biblical stories in a practical and reflective way, helping you apply these teachings to your daily life. So, what can we learn from Jacob? How can his journey help us see beyond difficulties and discover that God is present even in the darkest moments? And most importantly, how can we transform our own struggles into opportunities for spiritual growth? Jacob's story is not just an ancient tale. It is an invitation to look at our own lives and ask ourselves, are we willing to wrestle until we find the blessing? Stay with us, because throughout this video, we will explore how this incredible journey can inspire you to overcome crises, rediscover your faith, and like Jacob, emerge from the struggle with a new identity and purpose. Who was Jacob? Understanding the man behind the struggle. Jacob, one of the central figures in the book of Genesis, is known for his complexity and the many twists and turns in his life. He was not perfect. In fact, his story is filled with poor choices and conflicts, but it is also marked by God's grace and faithfulness. To fully understand the impact of his wrestling with God, we need to dive into his journey from birth to the pivotal moment at the ford of Jabbok. Jacob was born under unusual circumstances. He was the younger son of Isaac and Rebekah, and the grandson of Abraham, to whom God had promised to make a great nation as described in the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verses 2-3. Even before his birth, God revealed to Rebekah that her twin sons would represent two nations and that the older would serve the younger, according to Genesis, chapter 25, verse 23. When the time came, Esau was born first, but Jacob followed closely, holding his brother's heel. This detail, noted in Genesis, chapter 25, verse 26, foreshadows the conflicts that would arise between them. Growing up, Jacob showed himself to be clever and strategic, though some of his actions revealed a selfish character. In Genesis, chapter 25, verses 29-34, we see Jacob persuading Esau to sell his birthright for a bowl of lentils. Later, with his mother Rebekah's help, Jacob deceives his elderly father Isaac to receive the blessing meant for the firstborn, as detailed in Genesis, chapter 27, verses 1-29. This blessing, an important tradition in Hebrew culture, involved not only material wealth but also the spiritual promise of prosperity and leadership. Jacob's deceit had immediate consequences. Esau became furious and vowed to kill him, forcing Jacob to flee to Haran, where his uncle Laban lived, according to Genesis, chapter 27, verses 41 to 43. This escape marked the beginning of a journey full of challenges and transformations. During his travels, Jacob had an encounter with God at Bethel, where he dreamed of a ladder reaching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending on it as described in Genesis, chapter 28, verses 10 to 17. In this dream, God reaffirmed his promise made to Abraham and Isaac, assuring Jacob that his descendants would inherit the land and be a blessing to all nations. The dream at Bethel was a crucial turning point in Jacob's life. He vowed that if God would be with him and protect him, he would serve the Lord and give a tenth of all he owned, as detailed in Genesis, chapter 28, verses 20 to 22. This shows the beginning of Jacob's transformation, though he still had much to learn about fully trusting in God. When Jacob arrived in Haran, he found his uncle Laban and began working for him. There he fell in love with Laban's younger daughter, Rachel, and agreed to work 7 years to marry her. However, after the 7 years, Laban deceived Jacob by giving him his older daughter, Leah, in marriage. Jacob then worked another 7 years to marry Rachel, as detailed in Genesis, chapter 29, verses 15 to 30. This period in Haran was marked by hard work, conflicts with Laban, and the birth of many children who would become the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. After many years of serving Laban, Jacob decided to return to his homeland, but he knew this meant facing Esau. He feared the reunion, unsure if Esau still held a grudge. To prepare, Jacob sent gifts to Esau and divided his caravan into groups, hoping to appease him, as described in Genesis, chapter 32, verses 3 to 21. It is in this context of fear and uncertainty that Jacob had one of the most significant encounters of his life, his wrestling with God at the ford of Jabbok. Before we move on to this crucial moment, it is important to note how Jacob's story so far illustrates God's care, even when Jacob made mistakes. Despite his failures, God remained faithful to the promise of making Jacob a great nation. In Genesis, chapter 31, verse 3, God told Jacob to return to the land of his fathers and relatives and promised to be with him. These words reflect God's grace and commitment to fulfilling his plans, regardless of human shortcomings. Jacob's story also teaches us about the power of reconciliation and transformation. He left as a man who relied on his own cunning to achieve his goals, but was about to be transformed into someone who fully depended on God. The encounter in the valley, Jacob wrestles with God. In the biblical narrative, few events are as enigmatic and profoundly transformative as Jacob's wrestling with God at the ford of Jabbok. This episode, recorded in Genesis, chapter 32, verses 22 to 32, is not just a turning point in Jacob's life, but also a moment of revelation about the nature of his relationship with God and the divine purpose for his life. The immediate context of the struggle is the impending reunion with Esau. Jacob was terrified at the prospect of his brother's revenge. After dividing his caravan into groups and sending gifts to appease Esau, Jacob was left alone during the night, as described in Genesis, chapter 32, verses 21 to 22. This isolation is significant, as it marks the moment he faces not only the fear of his brother, but also the weight of his past and his choices. Suddenly, Jacob is confronted by a mysterious man who begins to wrestle with him. The identity of this adversary is initially obscure, but the text suggests it is not an ordinary man. Later, Jacob declares, "I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared," as noted in Genesis, chapter 32, verse 30. This detail reveals the divine nature of the encounter. Many scholars understand this man as a manifestation of God, perhaps an angel acting as his representative. The struggle lasted until daybreak, a battle that was not only physical but also spiritual. Jacob's resistance shows his determination not just to survive, but to gain something of value. When the man sees that he cannot overpower Jacob, he touches the socket of Jacob's hip, dislocating it. This injury is significant for two reasons. First, it shows the adversary had supernatural power. Second, it symbolizes Jacob's vulnerability, who, despite being injured, refuses to give up. Jacob then makes a bold declaration, "I will not let you go unless you bless me," as described in Genesis, chapter 32, verse 26. This insistence reflects a crucial point in Jacob's character. He recognizes he is in the presence of someone greater than himself, someone who has the power to transform his life. His determination to hold on to the man until he receives a blessing is an expression of his faith and persistence. The moment of blessing is profound. The man asks for Jacob's name, and upon hearing it declares, "Your name will no longer be Jacob but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome," as noted in Genesis, chapter 32, verse 28. The name change marks Jacob's transformation. Once known as deceiver, the meaning of Jacob, he now receives a name that means one who struggles with God or one who prevails with God. This new name reflects a renewed identity aligned with God's divine purpose for his life. The struggle also leaves a physical mark on Jacob. He leaves limping because of the injury to his hip, a visible sign of the encounter with God. This detail serves as a constant reminder of his dependence on God and the moment his life was transformed. This episode at the ford of Jabbok is rich in symbolism. The struggle represents more than a literal confrontation. It is a reflection of Jacob's internal battles. He was wrestling with his past, his failures, and his fears. More importantly, he was seeking the blessing and confirmation that God was still with him despite all his imperfections. The event also highlights the character of God. He allows Jacob to struggle, to test his strength, and in the end, he transforms him. This reflects God's patience and grace, who does not reject Jacob because of his mistakes but shapes him to fulfill the role of patriarch of a nation. The wrestling at the ford of Jabbok also has profound theological implications. It is an example of the direct interaction between God and humans. It shows that God is not distant or inaccessible. He is willing to engage in our lives, even in the most confusing and difficult moments. Furthermore, Jacob's story teaches us that the greatest transformations often occur amid pain and conflict. Just as Jacob was injured during the struggle but emerged blessed, we often face challenges that leave marks but also shape us for a greater purpose. At the end of the encounter, Jacob names the place Peniel, which means face of God, because he believed he had seen God face to face and yet survived, as noted in Genesis, chapter 32, verse 30. This underscores the special nature of the event, which was not just a moment of struggle, but also one of revelation and spiritual renewal. Persistence and faith. Jacob's cry, "I will not let you go." Jacob's persistence during his struggle with God is one of the most striking aspects of his story. In Genesis, chapter 32, verse 26, Jacob utters a phrase that echoes through history, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." This declaration reflects his determination and encapsulates a profound spiritual principle, faith that refuses to give up, even when everything seems lost. 1. The importance of persistence in the struggle. Jacob was at a critical point in his life. He knew that at dawn, he would face Esau, the brother he had deceived years before. Emotions must have been running high, fear, guilt, and anxiety. But instead of fleeing or giving up, Jacob remained firm in the struggle. Even though he was injured, he held on, refusing to let go of his adversary without a blessing. Jacob's persistence teaches us an essential lesson about faith. Often, when we face challenges, it is easy to give up, especially when we feel overwhelmed or hurt. However, Jacob's story shows that the blessing is often on the other side of the struggle. In Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 6, we read, "Without faith, it is impossible to please God because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him." Jacob exemplifies this truth by tirelessly seeking God's presence and blessing. 2. Unwavering faith amid pain. Jacob's struggle was not without physical consequences. When the man touched his hip, it was dislocated, leaving Jacob limping, as described in Genesis, chapter 32, verse 25. Despite the pain, Jacob did not give up. He stayed strong, holding on to his adversary with all his might. This endurance in the face of pain is a powerful metaphor for the struggles we face in life. How often do adversities make us want to quit? Yet, Jacob teaches us that even amid pain, we can continue to fight. He was determined not to leave that encounter without the confirmation that God was with him. In 2 Corinthians, chapter 12, verse 9, the Apostle Paul writes, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Like Jacob, Paul understood that God's strength is manifested in our weakness. Jacob's persistence, even when injured, reflects the strength we find in God during our battles. 3. Jacob's declaration, "I will not let you go." Jacob's declaration is a cry that resonates deeply. He was not just asking for a material blessing, he was seeking something greater, a confirmation of his identity and purpose in God. After years of living with the weight of his choices, Jacob needed to know that God was still with him. Jacob's persistence can be compared to the parable of the persistent widow in Luke, chapter 18, verses 1 to 8. Jesus tells the story of a widow who kept asking a judge for justice until he finally relented. The parable emphasizes the importance of praying without giving up, trusting that God hears our pleas. Like the widow, Jacob demonstrated unwavering faith, and his persistence was rewarded. 4. God's response, Jacob's transformation. At the end of the struggle, God responds to Jacob's cry in a way that transforms his life forever. He changes Jacob's name to Israel, saying, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome," as noted in Genesis, chapter 32, verse 28. This new name marks a new chapter in Jacob's life and symbolizes his new identity as someone who perseveres and prevails. The name change is significant because it represents Jacob's transformation from a deceiver to a spiritual leader. Before, he relied on his cunning to achieve his goals. Now, he learns to trust in God, who gives him a greater purpose. In Isaiah, chapter 43, verse 1, God declares, "I have called you by name, you are mine." Jacob's story reflects this truth. God knows us, transforms us, and calls us to a divine purpose. 5. Lessons of persistence for today. Jacob's persistence is not just a spiritual lesson, it is a practical example for our lives. We all face struggles, whether it is a crisis of faith, a family issue, or a personal challenge. In difficult times, it is tempting to abandon the fight. However, Jacob's story encourages us to keep seeking God, even when we feel tired or hurt. Some practical lessons include holding firm in prayer. Just as Jacob did not let go of the man until he was blessed, we are called to pray persistently. Philippians, chapter 4, verse 6, reminds us, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." Seeing the blessing in the struggle, often, the moments of greatest difficulty are the ones God uses to shape us. Just as Jacob left limping but blessed, our struggles can transform us. Trusting in God's character, Jacob's persistence was rewarded because he trusted that God could bless him. This trust is the foundation of unwavering faith. 6. Jacob's persistence and divine purpose. Reflecting on Jacob's cry, we see that his struggle was part of a greater purpose. God used that moment to transform Jacob and prepare him for the role of patriarch of a nation. He went from being someone who fought only for himself to a leader who sought to fulfill God's plans. In our lives, persistence in faith helps us see beyond the present and trust that God is working for a greater purpose. Romans, chapter 8, verse 28, assures us, "We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Like Jacob, we are called to persevere, trusting that God is with us every step of the way. The transformation of Jacob, from deceiver to Israel. Jacob's story is marked by an incredible journey of transformation. At the climax of this narrative, we find Jacob in a solitary valley, wrestling not only against a divine being but also against his own weaknesses and mistakes. This critical moment is not merely a physical battle. It is an internal struggle that culminates in Jacob being renamed Israel. This name change is a profound symbol that not only represents Jacob's victory, but also his spiritual transformation. From deceiver to Israel. The name Jacob means deceiver or usurper, reflecting his earlier life filled with schemes and dishonesty. From birth, Jacob was associated with cunning, from holding his brother Esau's heel during birth to his deceit in obtaining the paternal blessing. But in this valley encounter, something extraordinary happens. God renames Jacob as Israel, meaning one who struggles with God. This change does more than alter his name, it redefines his identity. This transformation is a testament to God's power to shape lives, even those that seem irredeemable. The new name Israel holds profound symbolism. Wrestling with God and with men and prevailing is not just a matter of physical strength. It involves perseverance, faith, and a quest for inner transformation. Jacob's struggle represents the battles we all face in our lives. When he says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me," he expresses an unwavering determination to seek divine blessing, even amid pain. This willingness to fight reflects a spiritual truth. Our struggles can be divine opportunities for growth and transformation. Moreover, this name change indicates a new purpose. Jacob, the deceiver, becomes Israel, the struggler. This transition calls all of us, reminding us that no matter how far we have fallen in our failures, God can redeem us and give us a new identity. He calls us to wrestle against the forces that hold us captive, to seek truth, and to live according to our renewed selves. Spiritual reflection. Jacob's transformation teaches us that our identities can also be renewed by God. Just as Jacob underwent a radical change, we too are invited to leave behind our old identities and embrace who God calls us to be. This renewal does not happen overnight. It is a process that requires sincerity, vulnerability, and a willingness to face our struggles. Often, the personal crises we face serve as catalysts for this transformation. They force us to confront our weaknesses, seek help, and above all, trust in God. How often do we find ourselves in moments of despair, questioning our worth and identity? It is in these moments that God calls us to draw near to Him, to fight for our faith, and to seek His presence. Jacob's story reminds us that even in the darkest nights, there is hope. The struggle is part of the journey, and God is present, ready to rename and redeem us. Practical application. So, what can we learn from Jacob's transformation? Firstly, Personal crises can lead to new perspectives and life changes. When we face difficulties, we may feel lost and helpless, but it is precisely in these moments that God reveals Himself in surprising ways. Often, the struggles we face are not just challenges, they are opportunities for growth and renewal. Consider the story of someone who lost a job. Initially, this loss may seem disastrous, but over time, it can open doors to new opportunities, new careers, and even a new identity. The struggle for survival can transform into a journey of personal discovery, where the individual learns to trust more in God and pursue what truly matters in life. Additionally, Jacob's struggle encourages us to persist. The phrase, "I will not let you go unless you bless me," is not just a cry for help, it is a shout of determination. In our own lives, we need to be equally persistent. When difficulties arise, we must remember that the struggle is part of our calling. We should not give up but fight with faith, seeking God's blessing in every circumstance. Finally, Jacob's transformation teaches us that our battles have a greater purpose. Every struggle we face is a chance to grow, become stronger, and draw closer to God. As we look at our own lives, we should ask ourselves, how are these struggles shaping who we are? Are we allowing God to transform us, or are we stuck in our old identities? What can we learn from Jacob? Jacob's story is a powerful testament to how God can transform lives, even in the most challenging circumstances. As we explore the lessons we can learn from Jacob, we are reminded that our struggles can lead to significant growth. God is present in our struggles. Even in the most intense difficulties, God never abandons us. Jacob's wrestling in the valley is an example of how, in our loneliest moments, we can find divine presence. Persistence in faith leads to transformation. Jacob demonstrated unwavering faith by refusing to let go of God until he received his blessing. This determination teaches us that perseverance in our faith can lead to profound changes in our lives. Our battles have a purpose. Every challenge we face can teach us something important. As we confront our struggles, we should recognize that they have the potential to shape us and prepare us for what God has in store for us. Consider the following questions. What struggles are you currently facing? Are you willing to trust God, even in difficulties? How can you seek God's blessing in your battles? These questions can be used for group discussions, promoting an environment of support and reflection. Enhancing your prayer life. Set aside daily time to connect with God through prayer, seeking not only help but also an attitude of gratitude. Study the Scriptures. Delve into the Word of God and strive to understand how stories of faith and perseverance can inspire your own life. Share your struggles. Talk with friends or members of your community about your difficulties. Mutual support can bring encouragement and new perspectives. Keep a faith journal. Record your experiences, prayers, and God's responses. This will help strengthen your faith as you see how He works in your life. Practice gratitude. Focusing on blessings, even in difficult times, can change your perspective and help you recognize God's presence. Jacob's story teaches us valuable lessons about faith, perseverance, and transformation. As we reflect on our own struggles, we are reminded that God is always present, ready to guide us and transform our lives. By applying these practical lessons, we can face our challenges with hope and determination. Jacob not only survived his struggle but emerged from it as a new person, ready to fulfill God's purpose. Similarly, we can transform amidst our difficulties, allowing God to renew us. As we conclude our exploration of Jacob's life, we are invited to reflect on how our experiences can become opportunities for spiritual growth. We can draw inspiration from Jacob's struggle and the hope it brings, knowing that, like Him, we are not alone in our battles. God never gives up on us, and our struggles can lead us to a deeper and more meaningful life of faith. May we leave here today with a determination to fight for our blessings, trusting that God is always by our side, transforming us into who He has called us to be.